I love German diction.
He wrote a textbook, and Dr. Hornet invited him to talk about the kind of the process of how you write said textbook. It's crazy.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. The last section here. So right now we have Randi Wooding. She'll present on perception of non-vibrato sung tones. So Randi.
Hi, you guys. So like you said, my name is Randi Wooding. I study vocal pedagogy and performance at the University of Texas at San Antonio. My faculty supervisor on my research this year was Professor John Nix, who some of you may have met. I think he came here recently and did a little talk with you guys, so you may know him. So before we start kind of getting our brain wheels turning, let's play a little game to kind of wake everybody up, okay? I know it's getting toasty in here, you get sleepy. So don't overthink this. What I want you to do is just go with your initial gut feeling here. I'm going to play an audio sample, and I would like you to raise your hand if you perceive the tone as non-vibrato. Non-vibrato. Woo! Let's turn that down a little bit. Like way down. Let's try that again. Still too loud. Okay, so raise your hand if you think that's non-vibrato. Okay. Next one. Same thing. I'm scared. One more time. Raise your hand if you think that's non-vibrato. Okay. Now let's try this one. Now this one's very quiet, so I have to turn it back up. One more time. Raise your hand if you think that's non-vibrato. Okay. So a couple of hands went up, okay. And the last one. One more time. Really tune in. Raise your hand if you think that's non-vibrato. We're kind of split. Everybody over here is like, yeah. Everybody over here is not buying it. Okay, good. So before we start kind of delving into that, you can tell it gets pretty hard to distinguish. Is this non-vibrato? Yeah, so before we go any further, let me just give you a little bit of info about our study we did. So this study utilized audio samples we took from a previous study that Mr. Nix did. We de-identified all the samples, but they're soprano, human voices singing open A, ah, at C5, so the C above middle C, for about 4 to 5 seconds. So our subjects, our listeners, took an online survey that featured 40 of these samples with various vibrato rates and extents. And some of the samples were repeated to measure consistency in the responses. The listeners were simply only to answer whether they perceived the tone as vibrato or non-vibrato. Just vibrato, non-vibrato, simple. They were asked some demographic questions, most importantly, what occupation they identified with. And our listeners came from 5 different occupation groups. The first was college vocal students. The second was professional and semi-professional singers. The third was college and private singing teachers. and the fourth was high school and collegiate choral directors, and the fifth was speech pathologists. So before we go any further, let's just clarify a few terms. So everybody think back to vocal ped class a long time ago, okay? This is a really simplified definition of vibrato. I really whittled it down for the purposes specific to what we're dealing with today. There's still a lot about vibrato that we don't fully understand. We're still learning what causes or allows vibrato to happen, but we're getting there. But for today, I just want us to think of vibrato simply as fluctuations away from the intended pitch to be sung. So we have a pitch that we mean to sing, but as we know, humans cannot perfectly maintain that pitch. We're going to waver a little bit above and below in a periodic fashion. That's vibrato. Okay, which leads us into extent and rate. Extent deals with how wide of a swing occurs away from the intended pitch. Extent is measured in cents, with 100 cents as one semitone. And then the other parameter that we changed on the samples was rate. And rate, which is measured in hertz, deals with how many of these fluctuations from the intended pitch occur within a second. So it deals with the speed of our vibrato. The fact that rate is measured in hertz can be a little bit confusing because we measure pitch frequency in hertz, but they're two different things. So let's just get a visual of these just to make sure one more time we have them solid. Here on the top we have extent. So we have the frequency, the pitch we intend to sing here. Let's just use A for 40 hertz as a sample, moving forward in time. So that does mean the vocal folds are oscillating 440 times a second to create that pitch. But we have these periodic fluctuations away from that intended pitch. These are our cycles of vibrato. And our extent measurements, which we took from Voce Vista voice analysis software, measures the total amount displaced above and below that intended pitch. So this total amount here. And rate, just think of rate as like a little blip on the scale. It's just a 1 second snapshot. Rate measures how many of these vibrato cycles occur in a 1 second time frame. So can anybody tell me, does anybody want to take a stab at what the rate would be in this sample? It's not a completely accurate sample, but what the rate would be? Yes?
4 cycles?
Yeah, 3.5. So like if we were starting here, we would have 1 complete, 2, 3.5. So we could say 3.5 hertz or 3.5 cycles per second. Okay, so let's go back to our game. And I don't want to blast your ears, so let me fix that. So sorry. Let's listen to this one again. Okay, so for this first one, no one, I don't think I saw any hands raised saying that that was non-vibrato. Okay, yes, because the extent in that sample was 104 cents, which is a pretty wide extent considering that these people in these samples were asked to sing non-vibrato. So that person was trying to sing non-vibrato and was still singing with an extent of 104 cents. So that's pretty wide. And then the vibrato rate was 5.1 hertz, which is a pretty fast rate. So just like you guys said, our study showed the same results. There was not a soul who claimed that that was a straight tone. And then we had our second sample. I believe pretty much everyone's hands went up saying that that was non-vibrato. So that's also a pretty clear-cut example. The extent on this sample was 12 cents, and it had a very slow rate of 2.4 hertz. So just like you guys said, our participants in our survey, 90% of them said that's a non-vibrato tone. Okay. Now our third one, let's listen to it again. Yeah, so, and this one, only a few people said that this was non-vibrato, which makes sense. Fairly wide extent of 31 cents on this sample and a medium rate of 3.9 hertz. In our survey, only 22% of the subjects said it was non-vibrato, so I only saw a few hands go up on that one, which is good. It means that you guys are answering the same as the people in our survey, so that's good. And then the last one. This is where we were kind of split down the middle. Yeah, it starts to get really hard to determine. This sample had a 21 cents extent and 3.9 hertz rate. So just like you guys showed, it was like perfect, you know. Half of you kind of raised your hands over here saying, that sounds like non-vibrato to me, and everybody else was not convinced. So this kind of game that we just played was how I came about this research. Just a few of us, you know, vocal ped nerds after class one day, sitting around playing with Made, voice synthesis software. We'd adjust the rate and extent. Okay, does this sound like non-vibrato to you? You know, just being nerds. And I was like, oh, this would be a good research project. So what we initially set out to find in our hypotheses for this research started with three main objectives. And they were, we wanted to find out if there was a threshold or kind of a falling off point for the perception of non-vibrato tone with regards to vibrato extent. So according to the literature that's already out there, we felt that vibrato extent would play the most important role in affecting the subject's perception of non-vibrato tone. So with this, we wanted to find out, you know, at exactly what extent does everybody start saying, this is a non-vibrato tone? We projected that this threshold would be around 19 cents. And the second thing we wanted to look at, we wanted to see if vibrato rate would significantly affect the subject's perception of non-vibrato tone. And again, based on the literature that's already available, we didn't really feel like rate would play a significant role in affecting people's perception. But we wanted to look at it. And the third thing, we wanted to determine if there were differences in the perceptual threshold across the different occupations of our listeners. We felt that choral directors would perceive a tone as non-vibrato at a lower threshold or a more narrow extent than voice teachers. So what we actually found was really interesting. I'm just going to go over these three and then we'll go into them a little more in depth. The first thing that we found was that an extent threshold does exist, but that rate significantly affected this threshold. And the third thing we found was that there were no significant differences across the occupation groups. So looking at these a little bit closer. Okay, so here we have a plot of extent. Overall, any extent that was less than 27 cents was considered non-vibrato by the majority of the participants. Analysis showed that, like we thought, you know, there was an inverse relationship between vibrato extent and the percentage of participants who said the tone was non-vibrato. So, the higher the extent, the less participants said the tone was non-vibrato. Okay, that makes sense. However, that kind of led us into something interesting that we found. If you look at this little guy on the graph here, out here by himself, this sample had an extent of 34 cents. And as you can see, 79% of the participants said that this sample sounded like non-vibrato. So why? That's a pretty wide extent for non-vibrato tone. So it leads us into what we discovered about rate. Okay, so according to what our subject said in the survey, and after analyses, we found that rate affects perception a lot more than we may think. Again, we do see an inverse relationship between rate and the percentage of participants who said the tone was non-vibrato. So as rate increased, fewer participants said the tone was non-vibrato. But interestingly, after we broke everything down, we discovered that rate actually held a much stronger correlation to the percentage of participants who said the tone was non-vibrato than extent did, which is kind of different than a lot of the literature that's out there today, where it really heavily relies on extent being the main factor affecting people's perception. Actually, you can see on this graph, you have this really clear trend, kind of this linear trend line through the graph, and it just showed that rate actually affected people's perception more than extent did. So that was really interesting. And if we go back to our extent plot here, that sample that we were just talking about, right here, 34 cents extent that sounded like non-vibrato to 79% of the participants. Why? Well, the rate for that sample was a very slow 1.9 hertz. So similarly, if you look at this one here that I've circled, why did we have a sample that had a 12 cents extent getting perceived by the majority as a tone having vibrato? It seems like, a sample with an extent of 12 would be a shoo-in for everybody to say this is non-vibrato. Well, the rate on that sample was 5.1 hertz, so it was a pretty fast rate. So like I was saying, we really just found that extent and rate, they work together to affect our perception of non-vibrato tone. And this can be seen a little bit better in this next graph. Yeah, so this visual we have here charts extent and rate over the percentage of participants who said the tone was non-vibrato. So we can kind of clearly now see how extent and rate work together to affect our perception. So you move towards the bottom left here, more people say the tone's non-vibrato, and you move up and to the right, more participants say vibrato. So just for example, if we had somebody in here singing ah, and we took a measurement of what they were singing, and it was 30 cents extent and 2 hertz rate. Okay, so 30 cents extent, 2 hertz rate. Okay, so this kind of falls into this 70 to 80% of the participants would still say that that's non-vibrato, because even though it has a 30 cents pretty wide extent, it's got a really slow rate, which it makes sense, if you think about it. If you're singing a slower rate, you can get away with a wider extent because people can't perceive how much you're wavering from the intended pitch. So it was just really interesting. Just makes it harder to detect. So this was the sad part of my research. I was really disappointed. Occupation, we tried lots of different analyses, but unfortunately we couldn't say that there were any significant differences across the different occupation groups, which again were students, singers, professional, semi-professional singers, voice teachers, choral directors, and speech pathologists. So I was really hoping that I could call up my old choral director and say, I've proven all those years sitting in choir when you asked me to sing non-vibrato, and I couldn't do it right, and you could stop. No, Randy, I said non-vibrato. And I'd run to my voice teacher, is this non-vibrato? And I'd sing it, and she'd say, sounds non-vibrato to me. I was really hoping I could call him and say, I've proven, choral directors demand a most unachievably narrow extent, but I can't. I was really sad, I'll have to get them next time, but so I just wanted to include this in here though. This is just extent, but all of our other charts look the same. As you can see, there's a pretty even distribution between the occupation groups. Everybody just kind of said the same thing. There wasn't any significant differences. So wrapping things up, there might be some other factors at play that affect our perception of non-vibrato tone. I'm not going to get into these into too much detail because I'm kind of starting to diverge away from the initial objectives of our research, but these might be directions we go in the future with this research. The first thing that would be interesting to look at is jitter. So jitter deals with how much variability there is between vibrato cycle to cycle as compared to the whole. So basically it looks at how regular or irregular the vibrato rate is. And according to our study, jitter increased as the extent decreased, which I found really interesting. And it just kind of makes you wonder, Juan Carlos talked about this earlier. One way we know that singers produce a non-vibrato straight tone is they increase the glottal resistance. They really increase the musculature, I think particularly the thyroarytenoid. So, I don't know. It makes you wonder, could this increased, tension contribute to that more erratic sounding, literally jittery vibrato? I don't know, it's just something we may want to go into in the future. And another thing that might be interesting to look at is sound pressure level, which deals with average fluctuation and intensity of the vibrato. We could see if that had any effect on the listener's perception. So again, just different directions we may go in the future with it that have interesting implications. Yeah, so thank you for your attentiveness. I know it's been a long day and this stuff can get kind of dense, but it's really fascinating stuff and I'm really excited to see where we can go with this in the future. So these are just a few of my sources. I have my whole list of them that I can send to you. If anybody's interested, just grab me afterwards and I'll send it to you. All of my graphs and wonderful statistical things that I had on there, I had help at the Statistical Consulting Center at UTSA, so that I could actually say the things that I'm saying. So yeah, just come grab me afterwards if you want the rest of my sources. And so now I think we have a few minutes for questions. Yes?
Did you find, when you were talking about the extent and the rate and kind of the fact that it seemed like your findings were a little bit contrary to what most literature is finding, did you see that, obviously this is a subjective thing based on what you're hearing, but that a really, really small extent, almost no extent, and then like a high rate, like almost a bleed? Did you have any kind of like pollution of somebody that's almost bleeding that people are hearing as vibrato? It's not really.
You said low extent,
well, like
high rate.
Yeah, just something that would almost sound like a bleed, like someone is just like.
Yeah, well, I mean, if it's a low extent though, like that one that I showed you, it was 12 cents.
Yeah.
If it's a really low extent, people like that the vibrato is happening.
Yeah.
It sounds more straight to them. But on what you said a minute ago about it being contrary to the literature, maybe I should have just said that I feel like the literature really points to extent being the main factor. I don't really think that there's been a lot of research done into rate. Yeah, so it's kind of a new thing actually. And then how they're tied together is really interesting. So, yeah.
I was going to ask a question about the rate. You measured it just by 1 second of each sample, or did you do an average of each second in each sample?
Well, when you say hertz, that implies just a 1 second time frame.
Okay.
So it is, I don't know exactly how the software does it, but in Voce Vista, I would imagine, it extracts or maybe finds an average over each second of the sample.
Okay. I'd be curious to hear about that because I felt like the fourth example was quite inconsistent and some parts were, and I mean, that gets into the jitter thing, but
That's exactly right.
I was just curious whether that was just 1 second or if it was an average of all the seconds.
I'm not really sure. That's a great question. I'm not sure how the software does it. I would imagine it's probably like an average of each.
I'm sorry, I'm not a real expert on this.
Yeah.
But I think it's a little bit incorrect to say what the software is doing because it would present the visual of the 5 seconds or how long the person sang. It would be up to the operator to choose the
To extract that.
within that.
Okay, so maybe he did
so
that.
I think what probably whoever, John or whoever did it, probably tried to find the part that looked the most consistent, not the widest, but just
Right.
the most consistent, chose that second as the representative for the
Are these
process
samples,
because the software doesn't do it itself.
are these samples from Professor Nix's?
Previous studies he's done, he's had a huge database,
Okay.
smallest research studies done, different voices singing different vowels, and I guess he's manually extracted those.
He showed us how he did it when he came. Yeah, it was pretty, it wasn't just 1 second, it was the most consistent
Yeah,
of the sample, as much as he could get in a kind of the window of the computer, and then he would put it in.
Donald Miller's book, Resonance in Singing, has a lot of how to use Voce Vista and how you can do that. So if you ever wanted to do that. And for the sake, just kind of while we're on that, the samples, I trimmed off the very beginning and the end just because the rate tends to speed up or slow down or speed up towards the end of the tone. So we trimmed it to make it a little bit more consistent. Do you have another question?
I have a question about your methodology, though. I will admit it'll amount to nothing. Could you back up in your slide just because it'll make graphically make it easier to ask the question? The one where it had the 5 professions in the bottom right,
Right here?
right there. Since you have, when you say like voice instructor at a college or high school, or I guess to some extent world record, that kind of thing, I think a lot of voice instructors at colleges would also be considered semi-pro singers. And since they get some of their
Right.
But since you have a separate category there, can I presume that pro and semi-pro singer means it doesn't have anybody in that category that's a student? And it doesn't have anybody in that category who's a voice instructor professional?
Not necessarily. The way I set up the survey was, upon opening it, this was one of the first questions they were required to answer. And the question said, pick the occupation that you most identify with. So of course there's going to be, those professionals who have a studio, but they identify themselves as, I'm a professional singer, or I'm a voice teacher. They had to pick one so that there wouldn't be any of that.
And then just out of curiosity, then the people who identified as pro and semi-pro singer, I'm a little surprised that you got them to do it.
Yes, I am too. And that's why I went to the Statistical Consulting Center also to make sure that I have enough responses, to say what I was saying. We really pushed this research. We got good numbers and good response from people. We sent it out on listservs. Facebook, I went and recruited. When Mr. Nix came here, I think he put a plug for my research in.
That was you. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was me. It's been, almost a year now in the making. So we had great response, which was good, and people taking the survey. So it's good stuff. Anybody else?
Thanks, Randy.
Yeah, thank you. I hope my accent wasn't prominent.
No, it wasn't. And we were, I think, actually some of us in this room were actually part of that research for that study, so that's pretty
Good.
cool. So,
Wonderful.
the next we have Chad Valentine, and he's going to talk about interpreting the title role of Ionescu's opera. Oh my gosh. Doing the voice and acting, the voice suite. This is Mr. Chad Valentine. Thank you.